Hello world, and welcome back. In this section, we are covering core patterns, strategies for mitigating risk. This section has been something I've told you about several times, and it's so important. The bulk of being able to answer and having strategies and patterns for handling the rest of the interview questions that you'll get, the one besides the most important interview question, they're in this section. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about it and sharing with you patterns and strategies that have helped me perform better and helped me evaluate candidates more effectively. Now, strategies for mitigating risk. Let's go back and remember what the goal of the interview is. The goal of the interview is to mitigate the risk the manager needs to own to extend you an offer. So in this section, these patterns are really geared toward helping you mitigate that risk. Now, there'll be two types of questions that you'll get. At least I put them into two camps. One is the scenario-based questions or the behavioral questions. These are the what would you do if, or how would you handle? You know, there's no one right answer to these questions, but they represent kind of the more difficult questions that you'll be asked because there might not be a clear answer that you can think of and that you can come up with. We're going to cover patterns to help you with that specifically in just a moment. The next type of question that you'll get, those are the knowledge-based questions. Those are the terms and the definitions, things that you learn in school or on the job. We're going to cover strategies for helping you handle those questions as well a little later. So happy to be here and to get to this point. Scenario-based questions. What are some of the strategies for answering them? Well, let me start off with a story. One of the questions that I like to ask candidates in order to figure out how prepared they are to answer ambiguous questions, questions that have no one right answer, is what is the best way to get from your house to the grocery store? It seems really simple. The question is, what's the best way? And you know where the grocery store is. And I've had candidates answer this question like this. They'll say, well, I walk right out my door, my apartment. I walk down the path. I get to the sidewalk. I take a left. I walk 2 blocks, and I'm there. Now, when they answer it like this, they're so proud, they're so excited. They think that, oh, great, this is a really easy question. It's a softball question. And you know what? Maybe I can't get this one wrong. But there's some hidden aspects to this question. The question begs to be clarified. See, these scenario-based questions are more than just answering a question based on the given information in the initial problem statement. Instead, the challenge is can the candidate ask the right questions in order to arrive at the most appropriate answer for the question? When I had this one candidate where I was explaining this idea to, and I said, look, let's say that somebody comes out into the hallway. You're walking down the hall at work, and they say, oh no, the server's down. What should we do? Well, chances are in a real work scenario where there is money on the line, where planning and scheduling and understanding the cost of the decisions that you make are on the line, you probably wouldn't just say, turn the server back on and see what happens. Instead, you would qualify the problem and you would ask questions. You might say, or you might ask, well, how many servers are down? And how many customers are affected? When did it go down? How long has it been down? And you might ask, has this happened before? And if it has, what have we done in the past? But see, these are questions, not answers. And the questions are going to help you arrive at what the most appropriate solution is. Because there is a universe where the appropriate answer for this question, what should we do, the server is down, where the response would appropriately be, don't do anything. Let's wait. Maybe we have a schedule for when servers get turned on or come back online. Maybe there needs to be an investigation on the server. Maybe the server's been hacked, and we don't want to disturb the state of the machine before somebody has a chance to examine it. So, again, it seems that it's more about these questions than it is the answers that are being given. When you are given scenario-based or behavioral-based questions, it's not that you can't think of one solution. It's that you can probably think of many solutions, but you're just not sure which one is the most appropriate. Well, for these types of questions, one of the primary patterns in this section is begin your sentence with the phrase, "It depends." This is a fantastic way to open. One, by starting off with "it depends," it gives you a platform to discuss competing approaches. It allows you to have a conversation about multiple solutions where one might be inferior to another, and with the added benefit of being able to have a discussion with someone else. You don't have to come up with the answer. That's one of the great things about this strategy that I'm laying out for you. So again, start off your sentence with the phrase, "It depends," because it does. The most appropriate solution that you come up with is going to depend on the constraints and the requirements and the state, the context of the problem before you can really settle on which one is the most appropriate. Now, I've had candidates even say that starting off with "it depends" gave them just enough time to collect their thoughts and provide an answer, provide a response that is more level-headed and not coming from a place of stress and challenge. So if just for that reason, I recommend starting off with the phrase "it depends" will give you the room to think in your head first before you start having that discussion. Now, the second point that I want to talk about is don't assume the general case. When you're given scenario-based questions, the question itself lacks detail. It calls out for investigation. And if you make assumptions about the context of the problem, you're going to miss the opportunity to arrive at the most appropriate solution, making your life easier. The general case, when you solve for the general case, you end up doing more work than you might need to. In the next section, we'll be talking about whiteboard strategies, and one of the key things there is being able to do a requirements gathering phase where you're clarifying what are the inputs, how are we going to return a response, are we going to use exceptions, are we, what's the base functionality that the solution needs to have. We're going to discuss what are the constraints for performance or for memory. My point being, asking questions, clarifying unsaid requirements is critical to demonstrating your ability to communicate effectively. So, again, just like in that case where you don't want to assume the general case when starting off your implementation, when you're given these scenario-based questions, these behavioral-based questions, don't assume the general case. Clarify first. It's really important. Now, I want to iterate the next point. Even though I've said this a couple times so far, don't be afraid to ask questions. If you remember, in one of the past videos, I talked about not looking at the interview like a test, where when you're given a test, you're reluctant to raise your hand and ask questions and get help for the problem. But this isn't a test. Don't treat the interview like a test. Don't treat the questions you're given as though you have to answer them in a vacuum. It's not effective, and you'll miss the opportunity to demonstrate your ability to manage ambiguity. Now, what I see in strong candidates is that they don't have all of the answers. In fact, if they did have all of the answers, chances are their bill rate or their salary would be so astronomically high that they just wouldn't be appropriate for the position. But they don't need to be. You don't need to be. You don't need to be the all-knowing with the ability to answer any question that's given to you. Instead, what makes for strong candidates is that they're good at managing ambiguity. They're good at clarifying the problem beyond its initial problem statement. So, managing ambiguity. Strategies for identifying the appropriate answer. Let's examine some of the patterns and strategies for this. First, avoid talking in absolutes. This is important. When I hear candidates use language like always, or never, or best, or worst, those are red flags. See, candidates that I've interviewed that have years and years of experience, I find I can't get them to talk in absolutes. It's always, well, it depends. It depends on this and it depends on that. And then I'm like, well, does it always depend on that? And they're like, well, no, it depends. And that's a really great skill to have. That's a really great place, a presence to have when you're in the interview. You're not dodging the question. What you're doing is you're expressing that you have a broader knowledge of what it might take to solve any particular problem, such that we need to clarify some things before we even start the implementation. You don't want to be writing code and finishing it and then turning around and going, hey, I'm done, and then the interview saying, well, why did you do that? I had that happen in multiple interviews. It was challenging. I was surprised. I didn't expect it. I had tried so hard. So I was interviewing, let me tell you this story. So I was interviewing in the Windows CE group for mobile devices for a C++ position. And the question that I got was, count the number of on bits in a D word. Now, the first time that I went in and I got this problem, I already knew that friends in other teams and interviews that they had had with other groups, that they had gotten this question before. And so I had written it down. I had come up with the best solution for this problem, and I memorized it. So when I got into this interview and they asked me about this, I was like, okay, great, I can do this. I turn around, I write on the whiteboard, I get my solution up, and I present it to the manager, and the first thing he says to me, the first thing he asks is, why'd you do it that way? Now, I was really confused, and I didn't know what he was getting at, because I thought the challenge was that I could even get a solution on the whiteboard. But that was before I started interviewing candidates and recognized what was missing from this response. Well, by the time the end of the interview came around, he had suggested another approach, possibly a constant time solution, and I was like, okay, well, great, I'll remember that for next time, right? So I go home and I write in my little black book all of the questions that I had ever gotten. That book contains all of those questions, and it contains the best answer for each one. Now I'm putting that in air quotes because I need you to understand that this is not a strategy that I recommend that candidates do, where you get a list of the questions that are popular, you go and solve it once, one way, and you choose maybe the most efficient way in memory, or the most efficient way for time, or that it's the cleanest code, has the least amount of lines of code in it. These were things that I thought were important at the early part and early stage of my career. But the problem was this. So a couple months later, I finished my assignment. I'm interviewing for another team, and I get the same question. And I'm like, yes, I know how to do this. I know that I can do this in constant time. Well, if you do it in constant time, it ends up taking up all the memory in the system based on the size of the D word of the integer type. So there's a version of this solution that you can still do close to constant time lookup, but it's actually examining sections of the D word, at a time. So you can still improve the performance of this problem. But my point was, I get distracted. When the manager asked me this question, I'm like, yes, I can answer this. So I go right around to the whiteboard. I start coding up a solution. I didn't ask any questions. Again, I didn't do any type of conversation or discussion about the analysis or the design approach that I was going to go with. But I get the solution on the whiteboard. I turn around. Ta-da! I'm like, okay, I'm done. And the first thing the manager asks me is, why did you do it this way? I was devastated. I kind of took it hard because I felt like, wow, I've just failed the interview, and I obviously haven't satisfied this question to the manager's expectations. I'm probably not going to get this job. Well, I didn't get the job, and that's probably for the better. But what I missed here, and this is the point that I want to express, you want to qualify the unsaid requirements. You want to qualify the context. You need to be comfortable asking questions. And that will provide the platform for you to have a discussion, a conversation, and to collaborate with the manager on, of all the possible answers that are available, which one is the most appropriate. This is a very powerful idea. All of these ideas here, when it comes to managing ambiguity, these solutions, these approaches are applicable across any job that you have, whether you're a construction worker or a program manager or a database engineer or an architect or a UI engineer. QA, it doesn't matter. Managing ambiguity is a key skill that managers are looking for. Teams want to have collaborators, people who can demonstrate in the interview that they have these skills. The next point for managing ambiguity is don't make assumptions and don't assume the general case. See, if you come right out of the park and you think, I've got this question and I have all the information I need to begin my implementation, chances are you are setting yourself up to implement a solution that is not exactly what is necessary. You might actually implement more than is necessary. So again, don't make assumptions and don't assume the general case. Now, the next point is weigh the advantages and disadvantages of one approach over another. Like we talked about just a moment ago, when you're having that discussion prior to writing the first line of code, you want to have that conversation with the manager where you are offering up solutions that might be not as, not as performant, or they might be below par, not average. They might not be the most appropriate solutions, but the point is because you opened up your answers with "it depends," you're now having a conversation. You're now able to weigh the advantages and disadvantages of one solution over another. This is fantastic. Managers hope that candidates can bring this level of analysis to the interview questions that they get. It's a strong signal that experienced engineers can do very easily, but students or candidates that have just come out of college or university, they don't quite have the experience. They're book smart, but they might not have been presented with the opportunity to be exposed and used data structures and algorithms that could be used in many situations. So if you're a new student or if you're new to the industry, your best advantage is to become confident and understand specifically in detail what the advantages and disadvantages are of each of the different data structures. Arrays, strings, stacks, queues, linked lists, trees, hash tables, graphs. These data structures, you need to be comfortable understanding their performance as it relates to the different operations that you can do with these collections. Insert an item, remove an item, search for an item, update an item. Each one has its advantages and disadvantages. If you can't talk about that, it can make it more difficult for the manager to see that on the job you would be skilled and competent at carrying that out. Now, I want to tell you a story. I might have referenced it in an earlier video, but I want to talk about it again. So I had this candidate that I was interviewing over the phone, and we had about 45 minutes to go through and for me to ask him questions. And we got about 30 minutes of the way through. He had done fairly well. He'd done well enough based on the questions that I was asking on behalf of the hiring manager to make me feel like, you know what, I think this candidate should be submitted to the position. But I ran out of questions, and I didn't want to waste and throw away the rest of the interview time. So I decided, just like off the cuff, I was like, why don't you tell me what are the advantages and disadvantages of choosing an array as your fundamental data structure over a linked list as your fundamental data structure? Now, his response was amazing. I was unexpected, because I didn't think that asking a question that was so basic and so fundamental would give me so much information as an interviewer. His response was, linked lists? I always use linked lists. Arrays? I don't even know why we need them. What? My jaw was on the floor. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. I didn't expect an answer that came from a place of authority. Of course, he was passionate. He wanted to impress me. He wanted to convey that he had a solid grasp of the topic. But his response was lacking. That type of response, when candidates talk in absolutes, I always use this. I don't even know why we need this. That's just like huge red flags. And I didn't expect such a simple question to provide me with such valuable information. Well, the candidate wasn't appropriate for this particular team because he would have performed not up to par given the caliber that the team was interviewing for. But that, I want you to know it's really important to understand that talking in absolutes, not qualifying the unsaid requirements, not taking the opportunity to have a discussion where you're weighing the advantages and disadvantages of one approach over another, but without talking in absolutes, like these are, if you can't, you need to feel more comfortable doing that. You should practice. Find time with your coworkers or with your friends. Do research online of the fundamental data structures and review those fundamentals. Now, the next point that I want to bring up regarding managing ambiguity is feel comfortable describing what you're not considering and share why you're not considering it. This is valuable. Again, this is just another way of saying don't make assumptions and weigh the advantages and disadvantages of one approach over another. If you come into these questions and you open up with questions, with clarifying questions, and you can feel comfortable talking about lesser performant solutions, it's really good. If you think that it's going to, sometimes candidates think that it makes them sound like they're avoiding doing the actual implementation. It isn't. These are skills that you would want to be able to demonstrate on your first day on the job. So when you have the chance, when you're given a scenario-based question, feel comfortable describing what you're not considering and the reasons why. The last point here, I want to make it clear, even though I've mentioned it just a moment ago, feel comfortable offering up average solutions. If you're writing notes, all of these points are very valuable. Use it as a reference. Find a place of peace when you're in the interview to feel comfortable having this level of discussion. You'll do much better. Now, let's talk about managing ambiguity as it's related to identifying the most appropriate answer. See, the most appropriate answer is going to be based on the constraints and the priorities and the context and the scenario and the requirements of the question. So managing ambiguity is about identifying the most appropriate solution. So in another way to say this is, if you're going to be asking questions rather than giving answers, and if asking questions is going to inform the manager better about what your skill level is, then I would assert, and this is a key pattern, that managing ambiguity is more about the questions you ask than the answers you give. I want to say that again. It's more about the questions you ask than the answers you give that demonstrates your ability to manage ambiguity. This is a really key point. It's really important, and you should definitely remember this. Now, let's look at some examples of ambiguous questions that people get. I've gotten, they're questions I've asked candidates. Well, the very first question is my favorite. I've already told you. How do you get from your house to the grocery store? Now, I gave you one half of the question. I gave you an answer that didn't meet my expectations. But here is what I expect to hear as a response from the candidate. Well, which store are we going to? How far away is it? What form of transportation do I have? Am I driving a car? What are we buying at the store? How much? Is it light enough to carry on my back in a backpack? Or do I need to take a truck with me? Like, for instance, am I buying 200 pounds of dog food to feed my kennel? What performance are the goals that we have? Meaning, are we trying to take the shortest route? Are we trying to take the most scenic route? Are we trying to avoid construction that's going on? Do we need to take the freeway to get there? Are we driving in the daytime or at nighttime? During rush hour or during a very slow time? See, how do you get from your house to the grocery store? These questions that I've asked means that I'm kind of well informed about the challenges that I'll face when given this problem. And the same happens when you're on the job, when that guy runs down the hall and says, oh my gosh, the servers are down, what do we do? It's more about the questions you ask than the answers you give that demonstrates your ability to manage ambiguity. Now, the next question that is popular that people get for scenario-based questions is, how do you know when a product is ready to ship? Now, when I was younger, my early career at Microsoft, I was a test engineer, and naively, I was like, well, we can ship when all the bugs are fixed. Well, I learned fairly quickly that products actually ship with bugs. It depends on what the priority is, what the severity is, what the effect on the customer is, but you can't just say that a product is ready to ship when there are no more bugs. You would never ship. At least back in the day, that's the way it was. So understanding what questions to ask, like, well, how many new features are we adding to the product schedule versus the bugs that are being found versus the bugs that are being fixed? Are we past feature complete? Are we just in code fix phase? How many bugs do we have? And what are the constraints? Do we have commitments with external teams, maybe with external companies? Maybe we have an upcoming product launch and we can't miss that date. How do you know when a product is ready to ship is based on many factors. So again, the questions that you ask will demonstrate your wisdom, your knowledge, your experience, your exposure to product development. Feel comfortable asking questions. The next question that is popular is, what do you do if there's a conflict on your team? You might have gotten this question as well. Sometimes these questions are the hard ones, the ones that are asked near the end of an interview. Maybe you'll get asked these types of questions from the group manager, somebody who's above the hiring manager for the position. Well, managing ambiguity, asking questions, clarifying the context is critical. For this one, I would start off with questions like, well, when did the conflict occur? Has it been going on for very long? Has the people who had the conflict, do they always butt heads? Are they always having conflict with each other? Or is it one particular person that is having a conflict with many people and it just happens to be one person at this time? What's the severity of the conflict? Is this that somebody is taking their shoes off and their feet smell? Or was this a more severe and actionable issue that requires immediate attention? See, the response that you give, the answer that you give, is going to be based on the answers to these questions. So, you have to feel comfortable asking questions. Now, the next question that's popular is, how do you rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10? This, in the beginning of my career, I struggled with. And, in fact, back at the beginning of this series of videos, during the introduction, I talked about a horror story when I was asked this question. So I'll tell you this story now. I had just interviewed at the Windows Update group. I was interviewing for a position as a developer in test, and when I met with the manager, we went through the interview and I answered all of his questions. I was truthful and honest and transparent. So when I got to the end of the interview and he asked me this question, like, how do you rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10? I didn't know that what I needed to do was to put within context of what the requirements of the position were. And I just gave a number. 7 seems good. I mean, 10, that would be somebody who's perfect, and, well, you don't want to go lower than 4, and so I'll pick a safe number and I'll pick 7. You can't answer this question without qualifying what are the requirements. How am I going to be able to meet the needs of the position that I'm interviewing for? So had I asked questions, I think I would have answered this question better. Now, there was another question that he asked me immediately after that, which was, list 5 of your strengths and 5 of your weaknesses. Maybe it was 3. It doesn't matter. What I'm about to tell you would shock anybody. Now, I had thought, you know what? He knows everything about me. He has my resume. He's asked me so many questions that I've given him answers to. I guess, he might really want something like deep, or maybe he wanted to know what the skeletons were that were in my closet. So this was this was a moment where it came back to me about 30 days later when he asked me into his office, because I got the job. I'll tell you what the response is in just a second, but I need to provide some context here. So in the Windows Update division, while I was there, within the first 4 weeks, I had discovered how to calculate the number of pirated versions of Windows running around the world. Now, this data you'd think would have already been known by Microsoft, but in fact, when I arrived in the team, the story I was told was for 5 years, the team has asserted that this data was unavailable. I did some simple analysis based on the data we had available. I was able to discover a way to look at the problem so that we could actually extract an accurate number, at least within an order of magnitude. Well, 4 weeks later, my boss invites me into his office, and he says, I have some good news and I have some bad news. I said, okay, well, tell me the good news. And he said, Brian Valentine, the vice president of the Windows division, he's walking by my office every single day and he's asking, how's Chris Tuttle doing? What? This is crazy. I've never had this level of attention in my career, in my life. And the fact that an executive knows my name, and for a good reason, was unexpected. So he was very proud that I was able to contribute to his team in such a way that it was having direct contributions to the bottom line of Microsoft. In fact, this data that I was able to generate was used to build out the Windows Genuine Advantage program at Microsoft. It gave people jobs. But you might be sitting there shaking your head. Oh, you're the guy responsible for that annoying message that comes up in the lower right-hand corner of Windows after you do a first-time install. Yes, I guess I'm that guy. Well, so he was proud, and he wanted to share the good news with me. So I was like, great, well, what's the bad news? He said, I should slap you for how you answered the question, list 3 of your strengths and 3 of your weaknesses in the interview. I was like, what? He said, don't ever do that again. He said, I was this close to not hiring you for the position. And obviously your contributions were way exceeded your answer that you gave in the interview that made me almost decide to pass on you. Well, what I said in the interview when he asked me this question, I'm a little embarrassed, but I'm honest, and I want to share this with you guys because we all have horror stories, even successful engineers that have been working many, many years. My response to this question was, well, I start projects that I never finish, I have trouble focusing, and I suffer from ADHD. Oh, okay, wow. So he wasn't looking for this level of detail. He wasn't looking for me to bare my soul. He needed context. I should have qualified the context of strengths and weaknesses. Instead, I just assumed that what he wanted was this kind of data. Well, I did get the job, and I did successfully contribute in a very valuable way to the Windows Update division. And I really want to say that when you are getting these ambiguous questions, don't give an answer. If you find the urge to give a response immediately, hold back, start with the phrase "it depends," and explore the context of the problem before you give an answer. Now, let's move on to knowledge-based questions and strategies for answering these. These, again, are just like terms and definitions and key things that'll never change. It's not dependent on anything. Like, for instance, when might you use a binary tree, and what performance characteristics do you get on a binary search? Well, those are well known and fully documented, logarithmic, of course, and log n. And these kinds of questions, they don't need context in order for you to answer it. So instead, the first strategy, the first pattern that I want you to take away is that when you're answering knowledge-based questions, you need to talk about what you do know and avoid talking about what you don't. What does this mean? Again, if you end up spending time in the interview trying to talk about some subject that you're neither an expert on or that you could hit the ground running tomorrow with and be able to contribute, you need to answer it a different way. You should avoid trying to answer these questions and instead feel comfortable saying, I don't know. Now, I have candidates that, and I felt this way too, I felt like, well, if I can't answer all of the questions, then I probably won't get hired, right? I thought that back in my early career, but that's not the case. The decision to hire you is going to be based on many factors that affect the success of the project and the risk the manager needs to own to extend you an offer. There might be factors that you are unaware of, that the manager cannot tell you about, that might make you the perfect candidate, even though you can't answer all of the questions that he gives you. This is fine. This is really, really good. Because the next point, the next pattern here, the next strategy is feel comfortable saying, I don't know. The benefit is that by saying I don't know, you give a hard stop on a topic and you give the signal to the manager that you're ready to start answering the next question. But as far as this question, we don't need to go any further because it's not going to bear any fruit. See, by the end of the interview, the manager can only hire you based on what you do know. They can't hire you based on what you don't. There's no benefit for the manager to ask you questions you don't know the answer to. And he needs to make sure to ask you questions that you do know the answer to so that he can assess the risk. Now, there's another reason why saying I don't know is important. Now, I just said that the manager wants to ask you questions you can answer. But there are situations. There's one situation that makes asking a question the candidate doesn't know a valuable situation. It's a way to calibrate the candidate. When I ask a candidate a question and he knows the answer, I might decide to ask another question that might be deeper. Okay, sure, you know what the multi-threading primitives are, and maybe you know the difference between a mutex and a semaphore, but maybe you might not know what a spin lock is. But I might want to find out, how deep does that rabbit hole go? I'll ask questions till I get to the point where the candidate says, I don't know. Now, I'll tell this story. I think I told it earlier in the introduction that I had a candidate that I couldn't get to say, I don't know. It didn't matter what question I've asked him. I could have asked him, how would you save the world? And he might just give me an answer. Or I might ask him, how do you build a processor? And he would give me an answer. But I'm exaggerating, but the point is I couldn't get him to say, I don't know. I could not calibrate the answers that he had already answered that he was asserting that he knew. Being able to say, I don't know, allows the manager to place in the spectrum of answers you've already given a clear scope of what it is you know and what it is you're capable of doing. So saying I don't know isn't a bad thing. I used to think it was. In the early part of my career, I thought saying I don't know meant that I wasn't enough, or that I could be better, or that saying I don't know meant that my grade was going to be lower. That's not the case. It's an actual tool for the interviewer to understand where you fit based on the knowledge you have and what you've shared. So feel comfortable saying, I don't know. It's a very important pattern. The next pattern is manage your interview time effectively. I mentioned this just a moment ago, but this is a specific item. You don't have all the time in the world for the manager to ask you every single question about your knowledge. There's a finite amount of time in that interview. And if the manager can only hire you based on what you know, you need to spend as little time talking about what you don't know and as much time talking about what you do. This is a way to manage the interview time effectively. You have to feel comfortable saying, I don't know. Well, this slide, this section, these items I've just spoken about, they're so critical for managing ambiguity, being able to demonstrate that you can tackle any question, even questions that you have no domain experience about. You might be able to fill in because you would know that it's not really the answer, but more the questions you ask that will help you identify the most appropriate answer. Now, let's say there are questions that you don't know the answer to, and you might feel the urge to guess. This pattern is important. Do not guess your answers. It's not valuable. It's not going to help the manager go, oh my God, wow, he was such a good guesser. We got to bring him onto our team. In fact, I had this realization that successful teams at any company are not successful because they're made up of really good guessers. They don't put on job descriptions, we're looking for really good guessers. Come interview with us. You don't see that. Projects aren't successful because people have made really good guesses. No, they clarify the requirements and they understand what's needed, from which they can make a strategic decision. I used to think that guessing was the next best thing to having the right answer, but it just isn't. Again, it doesn't bring any valid data, and in fact, it decreases the quality, the effectiveness of the answers that you've already given. See, it does more harm than good to answers that you did know correctly. And when you guess, it erodes the trust between you and the manager. And like I said in an earlier video, that if you think of the interview like an authentication process, where every single question is building a level of trust between you and the interviewer, then you need to spend as much time as possible reinforcing that trust. And guessing erodes it. It does more harm than good. This example related to guessing is important. I like to give this one a lot when I'm training. Let's say that you're given 10 questions. The first 8 questions you answer with confidence, with enthusiasm, without hesitation, and you get them right. Yes, awesome. You're doing great. The manager knows you're doing great, and you can't wait to get to the next 2 questions. But the last 2 questions that you answer, you don't know the answers to those. And you think, hey, guessing, it's the next best thing. It shows that I'm creative and motivated and have initiative. Well, the problem with this is the manager is going to hear your answers. Again, you answered with confidence, with enthusiasm, without hesitation, but you get them wrong. What this does is, how does the manager know of the first 8 questions that you answered, which ones you were guessing there? See, it actually lowers the quality of the trust that you've built up. It erodes it, and it does more harm than good. It's not effective. Don't guess. And you know what? If the manager pushes you to take a stab at it, just say prior to guessing, well, this is a complete guess, but I really have no idea, and then you can offer it. But don't just offer up answers as guesses as a way to address the question. Because, here's another reason why this is good. So I, as an interviewer, feel a responsibility to make sure that the communication between the candidate and I is effective. So when a candidate will give me an answer that's inappropriate or unrelated, or I can tell it's not even what I was searching for, of course I can tell that he's guessing. But I don't know whether it was the fact that I asked the question in a way that he didn't understand. So, time's ticking. I decide I'm going to give the candidate the benefit of the doubt, and I'm going to ask the same question a different way. Again, the candidate comes back, gives a slightly different response, still not on point, and I still don't know as an interviewer. Am I just missing the point? Is there a language barrier here going on? And I might even do it a third or fourth time, and all of a sudden 20 minutes are gone because we spent the time talking about something the candidate didn't know, and we don't have any more time in the interview to ask him enough questions in order to mitigate the risk and be able to extend him an offer. The manager, you see, the manager wants you to be the last candidate he interviews. He wants you to do well in the interview. It's not effective for interviewers to ask questions to rule candidates out. They need to ask questions to qualify candidates in. So trust that when a manager asks you a question that you don't know the answer to, give up, raise the white flag, and say, I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe follow up with, well, what would your answer be? Probably make it a discussion. But the point is, don't waste any more time in the interview. Move on and get to a topic that is something you can talk about. The Little Black Book. Oh my gosh. I have this book. It's in storage, and it contains all the kind of naive but ambitious and passionate, and it was full of dreams. I thought, oh man, if I figure out how to write these implementations of a copy constructor, or if I write the implementation for inserting a node into a singly linked list, or reversing the order of nodes in a singly linked list, if I write these perfect solutions, that it'll make me a better candidate. Well, in the beginning, my book was pretty thin. I didn't have very many pages. But as my career went on, I continued to add question after question, and I continued to add the right or the best solution to these questions. The problem with this was it made me rigid. It made me fragile and inflexible. It meant, well, I could code this solution up, but I might not be well suited to code up an alternate solution to solve the same problem. If you memorize the answers, then you won't ask the questions. You won't dialogue and communicate with the manager in order to also demonstrate your ability to manage the ambiguity of the question. So this book, looking back at it now, I think it contributed to what I experienced, which was early on in my career, I did well. The interviews that I went on, I actually got most of the offers for those positions. But as my career went on, it became more difficult for me to secure an offer, and I didn't know why. Looking back, after having interviewed 2,500 candidates, I realized that I was doing many things to contribute to the inability for the manager to mitigate the risk. And one of them was that I came in with answers already memorized, ready to put on the whiteboard, and really preventing the opportunity to have a discussion. It's not good, but I keep the book just to remind me. Now, sometimes you might feel the urge to impress the manager that the solution you're going to come up with first, the best solution, should be the fastest, or the most optimized or performance solution. Don't do that. Don't worry about that. If there's time in the interview, and if the manager actually wants to see how you would approach optimizing your code, you can do it then. But the best answer isn't always the fastest, most optimized, and performant solution. Think of it as the most appropriate answer given the problem statement and the constraints that you clarify. See, the best answer, or the most appropriate one, it reflects the unique priorities and pressures and circumstances, the advantages and disadvantages and dependencies that one must consider. You will have considered all of those aspects for you to arrive at the most appropriate solution. So if you're going to think of questions or answers that you give as the best answers, you should think of it in the context of these factors, these attributes. Qualify them, clarify. What's really nice about this is, in a way, by asking the questions, the manager actually gives you the answer. I struggled when I would get into interviews that I didn't know which answer the manager was looking for. Was he looking for a constant time solution? Was he looking for a linear solution? Was he looking for a logarithmic, or was exponential acceptable? I just never asked those questions, so I missed that opportunity. Don't miss it, and clarify the requirements and the constraints. Also, back up your solution that you give with context, its strengths and its weaknesses. Hopefully you will have done that before you did your implementation. And that does it for the memorizing questions. Just don't do it. Well, you know what? Memorize the fundamentals. Take the fundamental data structures, arrays, strings, stacks, queues, linked lists, hash tables, graphs, binary trees. Take those fundamental data structures and practice implementing, inserting a node or an item into the collection, removing an item from the collection, searching for the item, and updating the item. Do that over and over again until you can do it without even thinking about it, without hesitation. This type of memorization is really important, and it'll set you apart from the candidates that arrive in the interview that are like, hey, why are you asking me these fundamental data structure questions when I haven't had to write my own library since I was in school? I've had that response from candidates. They're frustrated. They don't know why our manager is focusing on such a simple thing. Well, I actually have a good response to that the opportunity is that the manager can see how you apply all the stages of the software development lifecycle when you approach this problem. Each stage, for instance, the problem statement, where you understand exactly word for word what it is the manager is expecting you to solve, with also a requirements gathering phase where we are clarifying the constraints, the limits, the priorities, the performance, the goals, and where you have a design and analysis phase where you're drawing little pictures and talking about how this algorithm would work versus this other algorithm, and where you can do pseudocode and implementation, and where you can apply some test cases to it, and possibly even debug your code on the whiteboard. In the next section, I will be going over what I call the whiteboard development environment. It's a way to structure the whiteboard so that you have designated sections for you to keep all of this information, a way to document the information that you get by asking all of those questions, and really a way for you to debug and walk through your code and talk about test cases. We'll cover that in the next section. But it's really, really important. This next item I want to talk about is getting stuck. So if you're given a question and the question is overwhelming you, meaning that the logic or the constraints that we're given are so large and so wide that it might be more difficult for you to understand the key aspects of what your algorithm is going to do, one of the strategies I recommend is to reframe the question. Basically, identify a simpler subset of the original problem to solve first, and then expand on that and extend it to solve the bigger problem later. If you reframe the question, instead of trying to solve for, 200 elements, solve for 2, solve for 3, get the empty case, the 1 case, the 2 element case, and the 3 element case. Like, reframe the question and it will give you insight. It'll give you a place to reach out and explore what you need to discover in order to solve the bigger problem. Reframing is a very strong skill, and candidates that bring that into the interview are evaluated appropriately. I think it's a very strong skill. So now I want to talk about impressing the manager. Might seem obvious. Don't try to impress the manager. It's not worth it. Don't try to charm the manager. I did one time take a magic trick to my interview. I did. You can laugh. It was a simple hot rod trick. I was interviewing in the games group, and I thought, hey, I'll show them what my passion is and what my enthusiasm is for some unrelated thing. So I pulled out the magic trick after the interview was over. I was like, hey, you want to see a magic trick? And it was the development manager for the team, and he was like confused, and he was like, okay, sure. And so I showed him the trick. It wasn't very impressive. And his immediate response was, don't do that again. So that's an extreme version of trying to impress the manager. That's a horror story I had. I don't take magic tricks to interviews anymore. I learned my lesson. So don't try to impress the manager. There are certain things that you can avoid doing in the interview that will help you step on the landmines and fall down on your face like I did in that situation. See, candidates, they try to speak from a place of authority. If you think that if you tell the manager, oh yeah, I know this. Oh yeah, this is the way it is. If you avoid being vulnerable, you think that's going to make me a stronger candidate. Vulnerability is a good thing. Not knowing an answer to something is a good thing, and it's a good way to show that you're okay with vulnerability. But you don't have to answer these questions in such a way as to convince the manager that you're amazing, that you are capable of coming up with the most efficient or performant and amazing answer. You don't need to do that. All you need to be able to do is the basics. There's a minimum bar, and if you can cover that, you're well on your way to performing well in the interview. So don't try to impress the manager. It's not going to help. Another thing that candidates try to do to impress the manager, and I did this in interviews, was, you're given a question and you're like, look, I have 2 ways of doing it. I could do it a recursive solution, or I could do an iterative solution. Let's say you were traversing the nodes in a binary tree. You could choose either approach. Well, the manager didn't care. He said, you decide. And I'm thinking to myself, all right, I will show you just how good I am at solving challenging problems in an interview. Well, why did I do that? Because I wanted to impress the manager, but it didn't make a difference. The problem was, by choosing a harder approach, I ended up using up more interview time, and it prevented us from getting to other questions. I wasn't as strong a candidate when I took the harder approach. So the pattern, the strategy, here for avoiding impressing the manager, take the easy approach. If you're given the option, take it. Make your life easy. Move on, get to other questions. There's probably a more difficult interview question coming right after this. You don't need to make this the hard question. One of the last things here is candidates think that they need to answer every question. You don't. Feel comfortable saying, I don't know. Let the manager calibrate you, and know that just because you can't answer every question doesn't mean you're not qualified for the position. The next point for avoiding impressing the manager is be frank, be direct, be truthful and honest and transparent and humble. It goes a long way to show that if they hire you, you're going to be able to collaborate with the rest of the team, that you don't come in with a chip on your shoulder, that you're not a person that brings attitude to your role. Just be yourself, be okay, and feel comfortable with that. You don't need to look like an expert to be an expert. Don't try to impress the manager. Let's move on to the topic of assuming you might know why the manager might or might not hire you. Don't assume you know why the manager might not hire you or might hire you. And this comes specifically from a story that I had with a candidate. I had this interview with a candidate one time. I knew that he was qualified in the position immediately, like within the first couple sentences of him telling me about his background and his experience. And I decided what I wanted to do for the rest of the interview was I wanted to poke around the edges of his work experience. I wanted to find out, what things does he know that he hasn't necessarily listed on his resume, but might be related to the work that he has done in the past. As I start asking questions, he confidently said, I don't know. No, I don't have any experience with that. Sorry, I don't know that either. And for me, as an interviewer, that was fine. I had already made my decision that I was going to give him a higher recommendation. But about 20 minutes into the interview, after me asking all of these probing questions, he says, you know what? Can I stop the interview for a second? I was like, okay. He's like, I don't think I'm right for this position because obviously the questions that you're asking are, what the team needs, and I don't have any experience with that, and I just don't think it's worth going on any further and wasting either of our time. Now, I did respect that he took it upon himself to share this with me, but one of the first things I said to him was, you're lucky that you're interviewing with me and not the manager at Microsoft. I said, if you had stopped the interview and you had said this, the manager would have been gracious and would have said, okay, thank you for spending time with us. We appreciate it. And he would have walked you out. But me, I can tell you right now that I'm going to give you a higher recommendation for this position. And the fact that you've stopped the interview and you've told me this, you're lucky that you've done it with me. So the lesson here is just because you can't answer the questions doesn't mean you're not qualified. And don't take it upon yourself to assume you know why the manager might or might not extend you an offer. That's not for you to choose. Like I said earlier, there are a lot of factors going on behind the scene. There might be other engineers on the team that have the experience that was listed on the job description that you don't have. So hiring you wouldn't be a risk because they can shuffle resources around. You can't assume you know why or why not. So don't try. Just go with the flow and be a collaborator. This interview, your interview with that team, that's kind of your first day on the job. So treat it like it is. Don't try to impress them. Don't try to get the job. Just behave as though you already have the job, and the questions you're being asked would be the same questions you'd get in your office on the first day. it's a good thing. You don't have to try so hard to coerce or convince. It's unnecessary. Now, you have to be prepared to talk about your past contributions, but you don't have to try to convince them that you are going to do something amazing in the future. Nobody knows. I didn't know when I was in Windows Update. You just don't know, so don't worry about it. In the next section, we are going to be covering the in-person interview. Like I mentioned earlier, the whiteboard development environment is a great way for you to structure the whiteboard so that you can follow the process of coding as though you had an IDE in front of you. It's pretty effective, and it actually helps candidates leverage the space that they have on the whiteboard. It's pretty cool. We'll be going over other aspects related to that, and but for the in-person interview. But that's it for this section, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.